Welcome, everybody, to the PFF College Football Podcast. I'm Seth Galina, a.k.a. PFF_Zeth, alongside my man, Diante Lee, PFF_2 Blue Sky Roll. So, Mr. 2 Blue Sky Roll, what is 2 Blue Sky Roll? Before we get into this interview we have with Nicole Auerbach, let's get into some TCU football. 2 Blue Sky Roll, what is it?
So it's a bunch of coverages, to put it simply. I don't know, obviously, you know how much people are familiar with this outside of coaching Twitter. Sometimes I have to remind myself that I exist in a Twitter bubble. Even within football Twitter, like not everybody is as into this stuff as I am. But it's basically like inverted cover 2. So that's what the 2 is for. Okay, when they say cover 2, it's really inverted cover 2, or what they call robber, because it's a safety in the flat and their free safety is playing like the curl. So like the way that they set up their defense, the strong safety is the guy that you would consider a Sam usually. So you think like, what I try to explain it as is, think of it like your regular strong safety in cover 3, the way he rolls down over the tight end. That's what their strong safety is. And their free safety is the guy who's playing deep. He's in the curl. He's carrying number 2 if he's on the seam. And the corner has number 1 vertical. The blue part is what happens, what they say, away from the passing strength. So to the side of the will and the weak safety. Blue is like palms, 2 read. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with that, but it's basically cover 4 unless the number 2 receiver goes out really fast. I was just installing this with some of my kids, so I am fighting the urge right now to like get out of my chair and demonstrate the footwork for working through palms. But it's cover 4 unless the number 2 receiver, the slot receiver, runs like a bubble, that arrow out route, speed outs, anything like that. Then it turns into cover 2. The corner plays a flat. The safety would then roll over to the deep half, and the will linebacker will play that hook curl area. Let's see, what else do I have? Sky is their 2-back check. So now you can see why what TCU does is kind of particular, because they can get pretty wordy. So versus 2-back, so think like old school 21 personnel, like you're playing the 49ers or something, away from the tight end. Now that's going to turn into inverted cover 2 as well. So Sky is just telling him that he's in Sky run support, meaning the safety is the guy who's in the alley. And it's just inverted cover 2. And then roll is their trips check. And really, you know, all roll is like playing 2. It's like playing their version of cover 2 to 3 receivers. So the corner splits number 1 and number 2. He's deeper than the deepest between those 2. The free safety splits the deepest between number 2 and number 3. And then on the backside, they will be playing Sky. They will play Bronco, which is another coverage check out of theirs. It's kind of like a man match type of thing, to me, in my eyes, at least. And they have a bunch of other things. You know, they can run cover 5 on the backside. So they have a bunch of different coverages. Well, not a bunch. They have variations of the same coverage, and they mix it up based on how the offense aligns. So that's 2 Blue Sky Roll.
Let's get macro for a second. We don't have a bunch of time. Like I said, very interesting interview coming up with Nicole Auerbach from The Athletic that we'll get to. But getting macro for a second, talk about blue being palms, being 2 read, being trap. This has become the kind of coverage in college football and high school. Like, this is what I've coached it before. You've coached. I mean, you just said you're coaching it right now. Why do you think this? So, again, putting it into like, simplify it as the most I can. It's cover 4. Unless someone goes to the flat early and then the corner becomes a cover 2 corner and he jumps it. So like, why do you think this coverage, you have 45 seconds. Why do you think this coverage has become, give me the history of football that led up to this coverage being the coverage.
Okay. So the shortest answer is that in a defense, if you were a believer in palms, the way that people believe in cover 3, you run it because you believe it gives you the best of all worlds. It's not because you're going to like shut down any particular thing, but it's probably the best catch-all if you're like a 2 high guy, if you're a cover 4 guy. Because if you think about cover four, what are you weakest against? You're weakest against the slot receiver running into the flat because you don't have a guy with leverage. So you don't have a guy cutting off that route. So the receiver has free access to the flat. So you want a coverage that can morph into a coverage that will be able to take away the flat if there is a guy threatening it early. So that's really why you run palms. And like you said, this is the soup du jour of football, on the defensive end. You're going to see two overhangs on either side, inside of slot receivers, and, they're playing palms. And like I said, it looks like cover four unless one specific thing happens, and then it turns into cover two. And you do it to try to protect your linebackers because you don't want them to have to carry a vertical and have a run fit. And that's really kind of what it's all about.
All right, there you have it. The reason why college football looks like it does, especially on defense, by PFF _ 2 Blue Sky Roll, aka Diante Lee. All right, so we had this interview with Nicole Auerbach that we're going to get to in a second. It was one of my favorite interviews that we've done. Talking FCS football, talking coaching carousel, talking Chicago, and talking a little bit of Michigan. So excited to get you guys to that right now. All right, we now welcome the Athletics, Nicole Auerbach, to the program. First-time guest, Nicole. Welcome to our little playpen here at PFF.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we want to, before we get into college football and all that stuff, we want to get to know you a little bit. First time on the program, hopefully first of many times. Where are you from, first of all?
I'm from New Jersey. So if you've ever met someone from New Jersey, we are very proud and defensive of that fact. So ready for whatever comes next as a follow-up to that.
Me and Diante have a few friends from New Jersey, a few mutual friends from New Jersey, and you've now like just automatically launched to the top spot on their New Jersey rankings list. It's not a big deal. It's not a big thing.
I was going to say, mind you, that the bar is a little bit lower.
No, the bar should be higher.
You're pushing the bar up, but trust me, the people we know from New Jersey. Oh boy,
listen, I went to college when Jersey Shore first came out, and that was quite an experience because not everyone who goes to the University of Michigan has been to New York City or been to New Jersey or even gone to Newark Airport, and it's colored a lot of the way that they have viewed me and the rest of the people that I grew up with. So I understand what I'm fighting against, but also I did make my Facebook page Nicole Snooki Auerbach for a month. So I will embrace parts of it.
So you mean to tell me that all New Jerseyans don't walk around orange and Ed Hardy shirts?
There are
and the skinniest jeans?
There are some, but I will like to point out that not everyone on that show was even from New Jersey. We had Staten Island, New York, Connecticut. It exists in the whole region, but it's not all bad.
Nah, I don't believe it. I'm pretty sure all of it is exactly what MTV told me it was.
Well, exactly. You can't believe everything you see on TV. A lot of Staten Island accents in that show. That's
true. Okay, so from New Jersey, you love the Jersey Shore. You think it's the greatest thing of all time. And then how did you get into, so you go to University of Michigan. Well, we're going to talk about the University of Michigan football program in a bit, but you go to University of Michigan. You do journalism, broadcasting, that type of thing. How do you get into sports broadcasting, sports journalism, and then specifically football, college football?
Well, so fun fact, they actually don't have a journalism major at Michigan, or journalism school. So basically, I picked Ann Arbor and picked Michigan because my uncle and aunt who lived there guilted me into applying so that our family would visit. And when I got there, I was moving in, it's welcome week, you're trying to make friends. And in my dorm, the girl across the hall was a sophomore. So we were just like talking, and we were talking about like our dream jobs. And I said, mine would be to work for Sports Illustrated. She said she wanted to be a heart surgeon, very much the same types of jobs, obviously. And she mentioned that if I wanted to, if I was interested in sports journalism, I should just join the Michigan Daily, the student newspaper. And her friend was on the news side. So she passed along an email address to the sports editor, and I went to the meeting, which the first meeting was the day after the first game, before classes start. And the first game was App State. So that was my first game as a freshman, first college football game, actually, because I grew up in central Jersey, and it's not really a college football area. I was 20 minutes from Rutgers, but we were pro sports family. Everyone kind of geared their weekends around Sundays and the NFL, not Saturdays. So that was my first college football game of all time. And then the next day I went to the student newspaper meeting, and it was really fascinating. They basically like had a special section planned, and then they tore it all up and just kind of had to do like, what the hell just happened story. And I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was also very cool that there were like 4 students who were going to write something like that and be really definitive about it, and that they knew enough to do that. And like anything in college, you just kind of want to make some friends. So I picked up a story on ultimate frisbee, which is a club sport. Came back, made some friends, like kept going to meetings, and kind of went from there. And again, so it wasn't a major. You just kind of, it was like an unofficial double major. You just end up spending a lot of time at the paper. I covered college hockey my sophomore year. My junior year was men's basketball, and then football my senior year. I also covered football for the Detroit Free Press and did some freelance stuff as well. So my tenure there was the last year of Lloyd Carr and then the 3 years of Rich Rod. So I officially ended, my last story for the student paper was about Brady Hoke being hired. So it was a very interesting stretch of college football, and actually Michigan's, I believe it's the four-year stretch with the most losses in Michigan football history. And it was a very interesting time to be there. And so I always joke that like the teams that I covered had a lot going on. It wasn't always positive. People are always like, oh, like, do you root for Michigan? Are you kind of a homer, blah, blah, blah. And, I talked to them about, I didn't grow up in the state of Michigan. It might be different if I like had grown up, when maize and blue decked out in the house, but also the hockey team I covered was a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament and lost to Air Force in the first round.
Ouch.
And the basketball team I covered was the year after they made the tournament for the first time in like 11 years. Supposed to be good, preseason top 20, didn't even make the NIT. And then the football team I covered was Richard's last year. So I think that, having those experiences actually probably helps, because you really never know what to expect in this job. But the way that my career ended back into college football was after I did various internships in college. And when I interned at USA Today somewhere between junior and senior year, and then they had an opening. I was finishing up an internship at the Boston Globe, and they had an opening as a college sports, like digital producer, publishing stories, photo galleries, things like that. It was technically college basketball. So I got the job. I did that for a year, did like bubble tracker stuff, like coding, taught myself how to code, variety of things. And then we had a reorg. I became a college basketball reporter. And then after a couple of years, I added more college football duties to the job. Also ended up covering 2 Olympics when I was at USA Today. And then when I made the switch to The Athletic in 2017, it was because we were launching our first national vertical, and it was going to be college football. And my editor was leaving USA Today to start it with Stuart Mandel, and he knew that I wanted to do more football. So basically, since I joined The Athletic 3.5 years ago, it's been 90% college football. So I have a little soft spot for March Madness, obviously, and for college hoops. But yeah, it's pretty much all college football these days.
My friend, a guy I coached under, one of my favorite people that I've ever coached under in my life, his name is Ray Sagesse from Montreal. One of the few, not one of the few, I mean, we do send a bunch of kids out to D1 colleges, but one of the few guys at that time to ever go to a Power 5 team, University of Michigan. And I always make fun of him because it's the exact same timeline that you were there. He played defensive end. And I'm like, yo, you picked the University of Michigan, and you, in the 150-year history of the University of Michigan, you picked the 3 or 4 worst possible years. You played under like 9 head coaches.
I feel the same. Like, part of the reason I picked Michigan was for that school spirit, the camaraderie, and all that stuff. And I mean, you go to the first game, and then you're leaving. It's App State. It's silent. You're like 100 degrees because it's been super hot. I'm like, are people even going to wear these T-shirts anymore? Like, they say App State on the top, on the back. It's just going to be like reminding people about this year. One of my friends at the student paper, like, was very woe is me. So she was a year older than me. So she covered the football team a couple of years, but just missed the Rose Bowl. So like, she was just miserable. She was like all about her not going to a bowl trip, all of these things. It was just like, It's not you. We all are suffering through this. We're all not getting to, like, I didn't get to cover a Rose Bowl at Michigan. That was something like all the student journalists got to do. So it was an interesting stretch for sure. And I feel like the App State game is like my entry point to college football, makes for a very good like origin story for my current job.
Did you play sports growing up?
Yeah. So I played tennis, basketball, and softball. Softball was my main sport. I was fast pitch pitcher. And then I did participate in some powder puff football games in my day. And at Michigan, this is something on our college football staff at the Athletic that comes up quite a bit, because we have we have got Michigan State, we've got Michigan, both sides, but there's always this touch football game that the student newspaper staffs play against each other. So that was always fun too. But yeah, I played a lot of softball, so I was pretty much year round in that, and actually thought about trying to play that in college or walk on somewhere, but didn't end up doing that.
If you could have played football, like you said it's called powder puff football. Is that that's tackle football?
It's so. I mean, I don't know. Like we just play like juniors versus seniors, the girls in high school. I think we could technically do both, but yeah, you're gonna ask what position would I play?
Well, either what position you would play, or specifically, I was gonna ask what type of quarterback you would be if you were.
Well, obviously, I was quarterback on the powder puff team.
There you go.
And did successfully run a Statue of Liberty play for the Daily State News game as well. I would probably, I'm not that fast. Like I tried to be, like you try to do those drills. Like I hated running suicide sprints. Like I just hated conditioning. And like, it was a byproduct of tennis and basketball because you had to run and move around. Softball, you don't really. So I don't think I would be that mobile of a quarterback. Like this is not a Lamar Jackson situation. But I do think I can throw a nice spiral. So I feel like I'd be much more of like a pocket passer. I would require some good protection from my offensive line. Give you some time.
Yeah, that's I think we're all in the same boat in terms of unathleticness.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, I played they tried to put me at quarterback and I was too scared, honestly. Like I was too scared to play quarterback because I didn't trust the offensive line, and then I just played receiver. There you go. Exactly.
That would also be fun. I could also do receiver. Always, I mean, one of the flashy positions. I want to be one of the positions. Now that we're on this side of it, like I want to talk to the media. I want to like give them the entertaining quotes, tell the embarrassing stories about my teammates. So like I remember, like Taylor Lewan was at Michigan when I was there. And I remember like after he started to kind of break out, I knew he was a great quote because I done a story on him and Craig Rowe and their odd friendship. They were like kind of two sides of the same coin. And so I knew he was a very entertaining quote. And so Taylor Lewan starts to break out. They let him do a media session, and he's got like a tattoo of a mustache on his finger. So he does, does one of these all the time. So anyway, people started realizing he was hilarious and started like congregating. The scrum gets bigger and bigger. And someone was like, Taylor, like you have so much personality. Like not all offensive linemen, are like this. And he's like, I'm a wide receiver in an offensive lineman's body. And I was like, that's the perfect way to say it. So whatever position I would be like a receiver at heart.
Every offensive lineman thinks they're a wide receiver. I've been around football many, and it doesn't matter. I've been around high school kids. I've been around university kids. I've been around women football players. They all think they can catch football. Let me tell you something. They're all wrong.
I was going to say, I also think that I'm Dwayne Johnson and Deontay Lee's body. So very relatable.
Hey, I respect it.
Let's get into some real college football talk. And let's start with the FCS. We haven't talked much about the FCS on this program. You guys at The Athletic did some pieces on the FCS and how that's going. I think my main thing when I think about the FCS is, you've spoken to some of the coaches now. I know you spoke to the Southern Illinois, Southeast Missouri State guys. What was it like for them, and how do you see it playing out, going from like, hey, all of a sudden we have nothing to do in the fall? Deontay, you're the same way, right? Not having coaching in the fall. Right. Going from that to all of a sudden a spring season that no one's really ever done before. So how when you've talked to people and stuff like that, and how do you think it's going to go?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting so far. I think especially we probably won't see the impact really until we also see some of these teams play again in the fall, right? Because they're going to be playing a lot of games in one calendar year. And we'll kind of have the full sense of that. But it's funny because if you think back to when these decisions were made in the summer, when everything was really dicey, and you had FBS leagues that called it as well. I think the idea of a spring season sounds great. And then I think, it's just such a slog to get to this point. One thing that was interesting when I talked to some of the coaches you mentioned, I also talked to the folks over at Austin P, is like they did play a little bit in the fall, like SEMO and SIU, like they played one game against each other for the rivalry. And they were talking about, and Austin P played 3 games, and it almost feels like that was probably pretty helpful just to have something to work towards and not just kind of wait and get all the way to the spring. And you've obviously seen some of these FCS programs, including the Montana schools who are in the top 10 in the preseason, like opt out. And I kind of understand, because now that we're here, I see the benefit of getting back to normal, like doing a normal spring, spring ball, spring practice, getting on track and kind of gearing up to have a great fall 2021 season, because we're, knock on wood, hoping it's going to be a lot more normal. So it's definitely an interesting in between. I'd be very curious to see if, because people are missing football, are people subscribing to ESPN Plus to watch these games? Obviously there was a huge, the North Dakota State streak was snapped. So that's really big news, but I don't know if it's kind of breaking through for general sports fans just yet. I mean, it feels definitely different than the Alliance and the XFL. They had better TV windows. They were on linear television. I felt like there was a lot more kind of buzz around it. But again, like if you're missing football and you want to watch, I understand having the FCS there. That was the goal, right? To have this window in the spring. And kind of then try to get back on track in the fall. But it's definitely a challenge, I think, for strength and conditioning coaches and trainers to try to make sure, that they ramped up in time for this. Because basically talking to the coaches, it was sort of like a condensed fall camp in like January to kind of ramp up now. Got some weather issues you're playing through in some parts of the country. And then, you're going to try to wind down and then get back up again in August. So I'm very curious to see how they manage that and just playing so many games in one calendar year.
Absolutely. And I'm actually a Sacramento State alumni. So like all those Montana schools are in our conference. And I was kind of tracking how that conference was going to react to all of the scheduling difficulties. And you kind of brought up like schools who played those sort of exhibition style games in the fall. And kind of how that has messed with their schedule, and a team like North Dakota State turns up in the spring again, they lose a game. I'm going to, obviously a part of that is losing the talent that they did, especially at the quarterback position with their guy getting ready for the NFL draft. But I'd have to imagine if you asked everybody in the building, they would probably say, you're really kind of prepping for 3 separate seasons at once. You have your exhibition game in the fall, then you have to gear up for your spring season in the spring, and then you've got to find out a way to get their bodies prepared again for a fall season in 2021. So I can't imagine what that's going to be like. For you, as somebody who gets to observe and report on the game, what do you think the kind of like long-lasting impacts might be of all of this crazy scheduling that we've been dealing with this season?
Well, unfortunately, I was really hoping that something coming out of this would be the flexibility, right? Like I really hoped that people would see, and I was on the phone with BYU athletic director Tom Holmoe the other day, and I said to him, I'm like, I'm going to use you and Coastal Carolina as an example every single time this comes up, that it can be done. You can schedule a game essentially on a handshake agreement, play a game 2 days later. It's possible. And, I think that everyone knows it's possible now. And we've seen in basketball, some games get thrown together really quickly too. But unfortunately, like even Tom doesn't think it's going to carry over. He's like, I'm already back to scheduling for 2030. Like everyone's got games on the calendar, and in season, you're not going to see that type of flexibility either, because let's say there's like a hurricane knocks out some games. Everyone else still has games to be played, or people aren't going to want to play in a bye week. So I really had hoped that something like that would happen. And I think I'm going to start just kind of my own campaign here about like a bracket busters type thing, where like maybe if people leave the same weekend open, then you could schedule it 1 year out or in season, right? Like what if everyone had, the second weekend in November open. And then you could have some of the top group of 5 teams in different leagues play each other if they wanted to, or something like that, or even like opening weekend or week 3, and maybe you can book that, schedule it 2 years out instead of 8, right? I don't know, but I'm going to start talking that up because I just think that was one of the best parts about the season was that we got to see things like BYU Coastal Carolina happen, and they never would have before. And I think like that to me is one of the main takeaways I'll have of this. Like I will remember that game happened, that it was scheduled, it was entertaining. It gave us the Mormons versus mullet shirts. Like there was a whole lot around it, but everyone was just so excited about the willingness to play a game like that, that I think that overshadowed, what it did for playoff chances or New Year's Six chances or whatever it might be. It won over a lot of people that it was willing to be scheduled. So I think like that and the, this like all historical Alabama offense, like to me, those are like the 2 things that I think despite all the craziness and like, we'll remember the uncertainty and all of those pieces, but like the actual season, those will come. So unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be a takeaway. Like I was really hoping that it would. I am curious to see what happens. I think from a football standpoint, there's going to be some impacts with recruiting. I mean, obviously, the way that a couple of these classes are going to be evaluated is going to be severely impacted. And we're already seeing, with this current cycle and the past signing class, that guys were more willing to sign players out of the transfer portal than maybe give a chance to a high school player they haven't seen or don't have a lot of film on. I think, we're going to see impacts of that and just the roster sizes with the extra year of eligibility for a couple of years here. And then I think they're going to have some sort of hybrid recruiting model and calendar in the first place. I mean, I think a lot of people learned about Zoom and FaceTime and have, potentially a little bit better work-life balance without being on the road so much. I think that's going to be built into the recruiting calendar. I think that's going to be a lasting impact. I'm also just curious if some of the ways that people communicated and, maybe they felt that there were certain things that were better to do virtually or to sit in, again, like they've been in distance rooms, but to talk out versus necessarily just doing, X amount of reps at one, particular thing in a practice, right? Like people had to get really creative. So I'm curious if there's like little things, little tweaks that kind of come out of this that maybe you think, your team's going to be fresher in the fall if you do, or whatever. Like, I'm just curious, like those are some unknowns. Like the recruiting stuff, there's already a real impact. Everyone I've talked to, like there's going to be a hybrid model that has, the way that they do the dead periods and all the different access. But it's going to be very interesting. I'm also really curious to see if fans come back. The college football was already kind of dealing with declining attendance across the board. I'm curious what it means once we're allowed to have full stands again, if people will be more likely to come to live events or back to where we were or less. I don't know. So I'm curious about a lot of that stuff. I think there's going to be probably a lot of different angles to this when we come back fully that we haven't even thought of yet.
So that actually, this is good because this leads me to one of our listener questions. We have 2 listener questions for you, both from the same guy. But the first one is, what do you think the high school do you think the high school evaluation process can be improved in any way? That comes from us from listener Will C.
I think that it can. I'm very curious to see again, like I think the 22 class is probably going to be even more difficult to evaluate than the 21 class. So I don't know. I've gotten messages from parents of recruits wondering how to get their eyeballs, like how can they, send things to coaches. I think that we are going to see some reliance still on the transfer portal because at least you have something to base your evaluations on. And I think, there was a lot of backlash to the dead period being extended through the end of May. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you can't do camps either, right? Like there's just so many different opportunities that players use to get noticed and to be evaluated, and they're not having those. And to not have film and not have tape to send is a problem. So I think that people are going to have to get creative, but they're also going to have to think about ways to overcome that. Or even what if you didn't have a fall season? What if you did? What if you have a spring season? What if you didn't have a spring season? There's just not as much data as usual. And I think recruiting overall is going to be going through a shift as we get, it hasn't passed yet, but the transfer rule, right? So if everyone's going to be eligible to transfer once and play right away, you're probably going to have to, kind of like set aside a certain amount of scholarships for transfer players, right? Like kind of treat it as its own recruiting. Like we already have seen college staffs have like an assistant coach whose job title is like the transfer portal guy or whatever it is. All of that's going to have real impacts on high school recruiting. So I think, it's going to have to be really creative and again, just trying to, again, create situations where you can do things like at camps. But also you need that competition. You need to have seasons, you need to have games. So I really feel for the kids in the 22 class, because I just think it's going to be even more of a challenge than the 21 class. And we've heard so many of those stories of players, even players still looking for scholarships now, that felt like they never got noticed. And they also didn't get, and same with the 2022 players so far, like you're not getting that experience of taking visits and learning about what you were looking for by going onto these campuses too. So I don't really have a good answer, but I do think that it's going to be really hard for another class. And then hopefully, again, I think once you can find a sweet spot in a virtual / in-person model, when you can evaluate, at camps and at games and practices and things in person, but help build your relationship online, hopefully you are finding the right thing. But I just think it's going to be a little bit of a kind of a wild west, and people are going to be really guessing. It's going to be like a risk reward situation here for another little bit. So I don't know how you improve that in the short term, but hopefully with a hybrid model, you're going to have maybe better relationships built, and maybe there'll be less misses or transferring because maybe you are getting to know people more with Zoom and FaceTime, and maybe you're spending a total hours more with these coaches before you commit. I don't know. So we'll have to see.
So kind of sticking on the topic of recruiting, with your work with the Big Ten Network, you kind of get a very close look at the Midwest. And when I think about recruiting, especially when we're talking about at the Power 5 level, for me, I always kind of contextualize it as where the recruiting hub is within like that conference's bounds as far as like the kind of talent that teams are going after. So, in the SEC, it's obviously like the greater metropolitan Atlanta area. So out into Decatur, West Savannah, all those types of places, as well as downtown Atlanta, of course. In the Big 12, you obviously have Dallas, Houston, and those types of places. In the Pac-12, you have Los Angeles, so on and so forth. When I think about the Big 10, to me, I would think that a city like Chicago would be maybe the hub of a bunch of talent. And I don't know, how much of a perspective you may have on this. But I was reading this article by Matt Brown, about why Chicago does not produce maybe the high levels of talent that it used to. And I was wondering if you kind of had a perspective on that. Do you think that that's a matter of just investment in the Chicago area into football? Is it just that basketball has just kind of taken over as a sport of choice for the young men and women there? What kind of feel do you have for why that is?
Now, before you answer, I just want to let our listeners know that we do have two experts on Chicago, because you live in Chicago, Illinois.
Yes.
And I watched Save the Last Dance this past weekend. So we have two Chicago experts on the show.
They're equal. And I will preface this by saying most of my time that I have lived in Chicago now has been during the pandemic. So I have not been out and about as much as I would have liked. But no, I actually think that Matt Brown did a great job kind of laying out the issues, because it honestly reminds me of a conversation that started to happen. Like I was at Michigan 10 years ago, right? And it was a similar, the idea of like in-state recruiting pipelines in the Detroit area feels like a similar conversation with the conversations about Chicago. And Matt laid out, the resources, the way that the schools are fractured, charter schools, a lot of those issues that are new to me as somebody who who's been in Chicago less than 2 years. But the conversations about where people migrate towards and where people live and costs of living and pricing people out in different cities. I mean, you can see the data, like, the migration towards cities like Atlanta, and towards, more southern cities. And honestly, like that makes a lot of sense. If you think about where jobs are growing and where industries are growing, it's not necessarily Detroit and Chicago anymore, right? And so I think that that those are all factors for sure. And it always ends up coming up in the conversation about Illinois in general. Shouldn't Illinois be better, right? You know, you're like, okay, it's like an hour and a half from Chicago, get Chicago talent, keep them in state. But if the talent pool is smaller, then that's not necessarily even going to be your answer in the first place. And you can see like the numbers of blue chip players in the state is decreasing, right? It's not the same talent pool that it was, you know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever it might be. So those things are hard to reverse. And then when you have schools that are not, that don't have the resources or aren't as committed, I mean, think about how easy basketball is to support and to have basketball hoops throughout neighborhoods, or, you know, putting something up on the side of a house, or, you know, in a garage, or, you know, building a court, indoor, outdoor sport, right? Like football is a lot more expensive. And so I think it's a combination of all of those things, but it absolutely plays out when you're talking about traditional Big Ten powers. I mean, this is also like, you could go to any of the state schools and kind of have a similar conversation, like Nebraska. Why is Nebraska down? Well, you used to, you know, again, you keep Nebraska talent, homegrown, you build things. Like, is that enough? Is that formula that worked in the 90s, is that going to work now? And then, you know, again, I was at Michigan when Rich Rod was bringing in Florida kids, and it was Denard Robinson, right? Like it was a different type of athlete. And everyone's trying to go national now. Everyone's trying to get those, you know, we've seen like Alabama is such a monster because they morphed into that, right? They've now they not only build the best players, but now they bring in the best athletes and put them in space, right? And so like when everyone's doing that, it becomes really hard, especially when your talent pool in your area is shrinking. And I think that that's just a larger population shift. And again, where jobs are, where it is, you know, where you can afford to live, like all of that stuff has changed. And I'm thinking that there's going to be even more of that coming out of the pandemic, because, you know, it's happening right with the urban, more rural divide, or the burbs, whatever, based on, you know, wanting space. And if people are working from home, right, like that could end up impacting all of this too. And you have to think about, you know, the commitment to these sports, you know, what's on the chopping block, what's not, what's expensive, what are you able to do? I think all of that's going to continue to play into it. But I think, you know, the perfect example is like Illinois as a school, you know, and if you look at what's been going on and why they've run through coaches, because a lot of people literally just say like, oh, you're near Chicago, you should be fine. And that's not really the case.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm still I'm in shambles that they fired Lovie Smith because the beard was too good to be fired. I'm sorry. So like, how can you let that man not be on television anymore? Not that it's a lot big Illinois is on television, but that's probably a whole nother story.
I miss the beard already.
Okay, I wanted to actually let's get into your alma mater, Michigan. Uneasy times, I think, at Michigan, though we did find out this week that it looks like they have a new quarterback in Texas Tech's Alan Bowman, who actually grades relatively well on PFF. I guess what are your like overall thoughts? Like, where is Michigan right now? Where are they going? Has the Harbaugh experience lived up to its billing? You know, it's one of the things you talk about with Detroit. I had seen this stat online. I think maybe I brought this up last week too. I don't remember, but it was the top 25 just cities, I guess, metro areas in the United States producing both just overall recruits and blue chip recruits. And Detroit is kind of nowhere to be found on that list. So all of a sudden it's like, now I don't know, there's like a million socioeconomic factors, but you know what two cities are? It's Cincinnati and Columbus. So it's like, okay, is Michigan... Yeah, they haven't won a national championship. They haven't been to the playoff. They haven't won the Big Ten, all that stuff. But it's like, are they still like at their like kind of limit? Like, are they still producing at a level that they should be producing given where Michigan is as a recruiting territory and all that stuff?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting tenure for Jim Harbaugh because it's such an interesting dynamic with the fan base where every fan base has that like white whale, right? Where it's the the players who you always want to come back and save the program, elevate the program. Nebraska fans are experiencing this with Scott Frost too, right? What happens when you get him and then it's like not exactly working, or it's not to the level that you want it to be, and also not fast enough? Like, so you're at this point where, like, I don't think Michigan, as we just saw play out with the way that the contract was restructured and like the significant pay cut that Jim Harbaugh is taking, like, I don't think Michigan is going to be able to fire Jim Harbaugh. Like, it's going to have to be finessed. It's going to have to be massaged. And you'd have to have a landing spot to go to, because this is one of your most celebrated alums. And I think that creates an interesting dynamic where you just have had the fan base be very frustrated for a few years. Like, and it's not like calling for someone to be fired frustrating. It's just like kind of like angry simmering. And you're getting frustrated over the same mistakes, right? So it's like, oh, quarterback play. Oh, like, the offensive line needs to be better. And the quarterback thing is probably the most interesting piece, because this was someone in Jim Harbaugh who was kind of a quarterback whisperer at his past stops, right? So you're like, okay, another transfer quarterback. Because once you go with the transfer quarterback, you kind of have to keep getting transfer quarterbacks, because if you're in the system and you're behind somebody, why would you stay, right? So you see this kind of revolving door at the position. Then the one thing that was consistent was the defense, and then that has nosedived, right? So now you have Harbaugh really overhauling his staff. He's got, I think all of his assistants are under the age of 40 now, so he's got a lot of young, rising guys in the profession. And he's willing to take a pay cut, basically, if he hits those benchmarks of the things you want to do, win the Big Ten, those types of things. Then he gets paid what, a coach like that should be getting paid. So I respect that. I respect taking the pay cut. I respect, being willing to overhaul your staff and try these things. But people are frustrated. And again, like, the quarterback thing is really interesting when it is someone who is supposed to develop quarterbacks and help them work. I think one thing that's bothered people in the fan base over the last few years is you've had like so many different titles involved in the passing game and offensive coordinator and like calling play. Like, it almost felt like too many cooks in the kitchen. And then they would make kind of the same mistakes, or they would still be really conservative in the play calling in critical moments. And then you run into the fact that, like, I think an Ohio State team in a different era is beatable. It's not like 14 out of 15. Like, I think, right now you've got only a couple programs, the Alabamas, Oklahomas, Ohio States of the world, that are recruiting, reloading, and have a certain level of athlete that nobody else is getting. Like, they're not getting it to that level. And so you run up against that. So because it's your rival, because it's, the best rivalry in college football, and because they're in the same division, that is what's keeping you out of Big Ten championship games, which matter to a lot of people. So, and the playoffs. So it's all connected. And I think people are just cautiously optimistic that he'll figure it out. I think that, again, you just don't really have the same situation where, with Texas, they were able to get rid of Tom Herman. Like, you don't really have that situation at Michigan. It just becomes uncomfortable. And it's probably been uncomfortable for like about 2 years now. And, people are going to just continue to hope that things get better. I think, again, making the changes, people are getting very frustrated with seeing the defense get gashed by Ohio State or anybody who had talent, at the receiving position, anyone who could get the guys in space. And so, you've got to fix certain things and show improvement there, but really it's about beating Ohio State. And I just don't know. I mean, you got to think at some point they're going to do it, because you can't just beat Michigan forever if you're Ohio State. But right now, like, that bar is really high to meet. And there's a reason there's a gap. And every time, even Penn State plays Ohio State, it's about that gap, right? Like, there is a gap between the way that those rosters are constructed and then obviously execution. So, I think there's been some encouraging signs with recruiting, especially over the last week or so. And I think, people are cautiously optimistic again, but, right now it's March, and, they'll tell you they're a basketball school right now. So, they're going to get a 1 seed in the NCAA tournament and compete for a national championship in basketball right now. So that will be the immediate focus.
It's crazy how you just described LSU from 2012 to 2019, basically. That's exactly what you just described. And as an LSU fan, that you brought back some that memories that have become rosy since 2019 that weren't rosy before 2019. But it's like it's crazy. The defense was great. Can't find a quarterback. The recruiting. They can't beat Alabama. All that stuff. Blowing my mind here.
It's really hard though. Like when you think about, and this is one thing that I think has been, it would certainly still be criticism and issues for Michigan fans and the expectations of where people think Michigan should be. But the playoff era has kind of just totally shifted the way that we evaluate what a successful season is, because now there's only there's not even 4 teams that get to say it was a successful season. Like Notre Dame gets blown out and Brian Kelly has to tell people like, don't jump off a cliff. And like Oklahoma makes the playoff, but gets blown out. And the narrative is Oklahoma can't win a playoff game. It's like, no one's happy to just get to the Rose Bowl when the Rose Bowl's not in the playoff. And, Michigan beat Michigan State and Notre Dame in the same season, but, gets crushed by Ohio State and it's like a failure of a season. Like it's not, but we're just kind of so shifted in the way that we evaluate success and what a good season is for people. And obviously the leashes have gotten shorter on coaches, and not to say that Michigan still wouldn't want to evaluate itself compared to Ohio State and winning Big Ten titles, but it's definitely colored the way that we talk about success in general and what we expect from coaches. And not every program, can turn it around in 1 year. Not everyone, can one transfer quarterback will take them from here to here, right? Like it's more normal than it's not that it was going to take time, or that there was going to be bumps in the road, or that not every, dream hire is going to work out. And I think like a lot of us in the media were kind of reflecting on that when you think of Tom Herman to Texas, Jim Harbaugh to Michigan, Scott Frost to Nebraska. They were all like graded really well as like those instant reactions, and everyone was so sure they were all going to work. And, obviously one of the 3 is no longer the coach. The other 2 have that simmering frustration. People are looking for growth. And it just, it shows that, we're in this world where it is hard to live up to expectations. And especially when you have just a couple of programs, the Clemson, Alabama, Oklahoma, Ohio States, that are recruiting, replacing players at a certain level and retaining their coaches at a certain level. It becomes hard. And I think LSU is actually a really good example of when everything can align, you can get lightning in a bottle, but even sustaining that is hard. And what Alabama's done with the coaching turnover, basically what's happened to LSU, right? Like you lost a bunch of those key assistants. It's really hard. And so it's just wild when like the one team, the one team you want to measure yourself against is one of those 3 or 4 teams that's just like on a different planet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really not only that, what you bring up when you're like contextualizing how you evaluate the program in relation to your rival. So like for me, I know that on top of just kind of like the general paranoia that the college football playoff conversation has caused the sport and how we cover it in general, it's warped the way that I look at USC. Like, I was raised as a USC fan. My father's a USC fan, and he's always the one who has to talk me off the ledge, because it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that, in my particular scenario as a fan of SC, that they just got off of probation 5 years ago, which is a which makes like going 8-4, 9-3, maybe going to a Rose Bowl more than reasonable. It's very successful. But to me, when I'm looking at, hey, we used to be we used to be that. We used to be Clemson. We used to be able to go play these SEC teams and still look like the bigger, faster, stronger team. So I can definitely kind of sympathize with that. And the last topic that I wanted to touch on before I give it to Seth for the last fan question is kind of tied to that, and that's the coaching carousel. So for, obviously in the COVID season, it seems like programs are a little bit more reticent to fire their coach, pay whatever the exorbitant buyouts are.
I thought that they would.
Right, exactly. You would think. But the schools who were quickest to move, I think, are the schools who are trapped in that same kind of paranoia that we've been talking about. So whether it's Auburn letting Gus go because you're comparing yourself to your next door neighbors, whether it's Josh Heupel being brought into Tennessee. I mean, because of the recruiting violations that we're still waiting to see, but also we know how Tennessee feels about being this close to the University of Alabama in proximity and being this far away from Alabama in results on the football field. Sark taking over at Texas because the Texas boosters are probably tired of watching Oklahoma always being the representative for the Big 12. So all of these schools, these are like the bigger programs who have had these different runs at points in time, whether it was decades ago, 5 years ago, and what have you. So for you, looking at kind of like the coaching carousel landscape, are there any trend lines that we're seeing? It doesn't seem like, G5 coaches are moving up to P5 jobs as much. So is this just kind of like a story of now these really big programs who might take a chance on guys are really just saying, we've got to find the coaches with the biggest personal brands to match our big football brand?
Yeah, it was definitely, so we'll start with the first, I really did think that there might be a smaller cycle because of all of these athletic departments have had a financial crunch. I mean, these are some of these schools that paid exorbitant buyouts also laid off staffers, or furloughed people who make like $50,000 a year in the athletic department. And listen, I understand you're getting money from boosters, but if those boosters care about the athletic department and the athletes there, you could funnel that money elsewhere and potentially save other sports or scholarships or staffers in these programs. So it's all connected. And so I did think that people would be a little bit more hesitant to do it. But you see a place like South Carolina, make a change. You see, it's $20 million for Gus Malzahn. I mean, there was a lot of money floating around. I thought for sure no one would be near Willie Taggart buyout money, and then Auburn does Auburn, right?
Right.
So I think that overall surprised me. But to your point, it shows the lack of patience. I mean, I think, you went from Jeremy Pruitt being 2-0 and, people being excited, and they announced his extension in the same season to firing him. Right. And I think that to me shows exactly what this is, right? Which is, these leashes are really short. There's not a lot of patience. You're not going to get a full recruiting cycle, which is another reason why you see guys going to the transfer portal and hoping that a splashy addition, makes a big difference, gets fans excited. And I think that's just not going to change. It was interesting that it was a lot of retread hires and people getting second or third chances. That's not surprising for Sark, for example. I mean, we've seen that kind of Midas touch with Alabama. Anyone gets David, you're like, oh, I've been behind the curtain. Now I can do this at your program, right? So that wasn't terribly surprising. It was expensive to make the move for Steve Sarkisian if that was going to be your guy. And you can argue it ends up being $35 million when you think about the buyouts for the staff, hiring new staff. So it's a lot of money baked into that. And you're really banking on, hopefully things going a lot better than, the last time he was out as a head coach. And it's a pressure cooker job. And that's where, same with Auburn, right? You're getting rid of a coach who's beaten Nick Saban, to make a change. And that was an interesting one because, like you said, there weren't a lot of those G5 to Power 5 moves. There also weren't a lot of coordinators, getting the nod. And I wonder, too, if that's about, again, in a weird year where you're trying to sell things, if you do want someone with experience as a head coach, who maybe it's the way you said it with a personal brand. I'm sure, for Sark, it didn't hurt that we, after he gets hired, sorry, I did that to myself. After he, gets the job, it's basically like a 3-hour commercial of his offense, right? In the national championship game. Those types of things do help. That will help recruiting. And so, you got to see how that stuff shakes out. But it was definitely surprising. I would have expected, if people were being more financially prudent, okay, let's hire a G5 guy or a rising assistant and, kind of not pay as much as we paid the last guy. But maybe that's a harder sell. And maybe you felt like you had to go with a name more so than ever. But that was definitely surprising this year. I mean, even, Butch Jones, Arkansas State had been a launching off point for a lot of people's careers. That was an interesting hire to go that route there as well. So, I'm curious to see Gus Malzahn at UCF. I mean, some of these, again, that was another kind of a jumping off job with the retread. So I'm curious to see how it all goes. But I do think there's probably something to be said about the experience, kind of understanding all the different things you're responsible for as a head coach. And maybe that led into it. Maybe that fed into maybe someone else's decision fed into your decision on how you approached your search. But who knows? I mean, it's just clear with the buyouts that are being paid that we're still going to keep making the same mistakes where ADs extend coaches prematurely when they don't have a competing offer and then end up owing a lot of money when they need to make a change. So that does not appear to be changing anytime soon either.
Right. I think that maybe the biggest mistake I made was ever assuming that the college football world would make reasonable financial decisions.
I thought so too. I really did. There were people telling me I really hope this is a chance to recalibrate. No, it was not.
I can't even make reasonable financial decisions, so I don't know how. I
was going to say, I'm staring at a PlayStation 5 right now, and I'm chastising people about bad financial decisions.
Yeah, give me $1 million.
Well, but here's the thing: if you guys are making that bad of a decision in those roles, you still get to hire more coaches. Usually the AD doesn't get wiped out too.
True.
Okay, last question before we get out of here, and our second listener question. It's great to end on this note because it is such a hard-hitting question. Nicole, who is your favorite mascot?
Ooh, it's a really tough question.
Dee, you can answer as well. The floor is open.
So I'm very partial to live mascots. I think that they are very cute, very approachable. You can pet them usually. But I think the mascot that I haven't seen in person that I really want to see in person is Ralphie. I really want to see a Colorado game at Colorado so I can see Ralphie run. So I'd probably go with him in part because I haven't seen him. I feel like it makes him a little bit more mysterious. But I will say that in all of college sports, the Butler Bulldogs mascots, I've met the outgoing one and the new one, both. They are lovely and they are probably my all-time favorites. And also I feel like I have a personal relationship with them. So that's probably number one. But in terms of college football mascots, Ralphie.
Now you're putting me on the spot, Seth.
Yeah. There's no wrong answer. There's really isn't.
Whatever Dee says is the wrong answer. Trust me.
Ralphie's a really good one.
That's a great one, actually.
For me, as a California kid, I will say that, and maybe favorite's the wrong word for it, but the one that always seemed to draw my attention the most is the Stanford tree.
I love the tree.
To me,
but do you see that is the wrong answer? I told you that.
No, that is a good answer.
It is so interesting to me that you think about this hoity-toity school like Stanford, where everybody goes and ends up working in Silicon Valley or going to a law school, and just this very esteemed college, and you look at this absolutely unhinged mascot design.
I completely agree.
Insane. So
I love it.
That's my favorite thing because their band is also unhinged like that too. So the combination of those things, it amuses me very much every time.
All right, I'm gonna be pretty normal here. I'm just gonna say the Washington Husky, especially when he's a pup.
Say Mike the Tiger. I would get this call if he said
but it's I can't say Mike the Tiger. We're friends. We're literally friends. So I can't just name my friend. Okay.
Well, that's what I did with the Butler Bulldogs. Okay, they're actually they mailed me merch and a dog and a T-shirt for my dog. We're actually friends, basically family, honestly.
That's really where I want to get here in my professional career is having schools mail me stuff for. Well, I don't even have any animals, but I'll pretend to
someday you can both of those things for your future animal.
Nicole, thanks for joining us. Where can the people find you?
I am on Twitter at Nicole Auerbach.
We're all on Twitter.
We're all on Twitter
all the time, 24/7.
Unfortunately, too much on Twitter. You can go to The Athletic. You can follow by writer. So you can find my work there. Also been doing a lot of radio, Sirius XM. I do TV stuff for the Big Ten Network. So a little bit everywhere.
Are you working on a piece? I know you wrote the BYU piece today that people can go check out. Is there anything you're working on for later this week or next week?
Yeah, I've got a piece coming about Iowa State and their approach to spring football. And then I've actually got Rutgers basketball content coming because that's what the people need. The great people of the great state of New Jersey come full circle.
All right. Thank you, Nicole. PFF's number one New Jerseyite.
Yes. Thank you. Anytime.
All right. That was our interview with Nicole Auerbach from The Athletic. And that's the end of our show for today. Stay tuned next week. I believe we are talking quarterbacks. So get excited for that. See you guys next week.